The storm rolled in low and gray over the Montana plains the day Everett Kane bought the bride nobody wanted, pressing the sky down on Dry Creek, until even the old depot seemed to hunch its shoulders. Wind drove thin curtains of dust and leftover snow across the platform, rattling loose boards and whining between freight crates. But the townsfolk still came, curious, hungry for gossip, and glad for any distraction from the hard winter that just wouldn't quit. The battered steam engine wheezed to a stop with a shrill cry, and a long plume of white hissed out over the tracks, blurring the line between land and sky. Women pulled shawls tight. Men stamped their boots. Children clung to their mothers' skirts or peeked around legs, eyes wide. Everyone pretended to be there for mail or supplies, but their gazes all slid to the far end of the platform where a cluster of nervous women in worn traveling dresses clutched carpet bags and battered trunks. Mail-order brides, the newspapers called them, like something you could order out of a catalog and return if it didn't fit right. Everett Kane stood a few yards apart. Broad-shouldered in his dark trail coat, had pulled low over eyes the color of a winter sky. At 35, he was one of the richest men in 3 counties, owner of the Double K Ranch, half the grazing rights along Willow Creek, and a reputation that made men step aside and women lower their eyes. His leather gloves were lined with fleece, his boots were custom-made, and his belt buckle alone could have bought half the town. Yet he shifted his weight like a man, walking into a gunfight instead of onto a train platform, jaw tight, hands in his pockets, watching the brides without really looking at them. This was not how his life was supposed to go. The idea had started as a joke in the saloon 3 weeks earlier. It was late, the lamps smoky and low, fiddles silent for the night. Snow pressed against the windows, trying to claw its way in with icy fingers. Everett, his foreman Hank, and a couple of neighboring ranchers had been hunched around a poker table, cards limp in their hands, whiskey burning their throats. Hank had just lost the pot on a bad bluff, and was muttering about how a man needed more than cattle and cold stew to keep him going through a winter like this. "You ought to get yourself a wife." Hank, one of the other men, had drawled, kicking his boots up on an empty chair. "Heard they're shipping a whole batch of 'em from back east, women who don't mind rough conditions, or can't afford to." The men laughed. Everett had kept his eyes on his cards, but he'd listened. Another swig of whiskey, another round of laughter, and then somebody turned on him. "What about you, Kane? High and mighty out there on the Double K, all that land and money, no one to share it with. Seems a waste." Everett had shrugged off the jab with a careless smirk. "Last thing I need is some delicate eastern blossom wilting on my porch," he said.
"Cows are easier."
They don't talk back. More laughter. Another joke about brides coming in crates like farm tools. But when he'd ridden home that night, wind knifing through his coat, the sky a hard, starless black, the words wouldn't leave him alone. He rode through the dark and thought of his father's unfinished legacy, of the big ranch house he'd built 3 years ago that still felt empty no matter how many fires he lit or how many men sat at his long table. He thought of the letter that had arrived last summer from his younger sister, now married in St. Louis with a baby on the way, asking when he was going to find someone, settle down, stop living like a ghost on the edge of the world. He'd crumpled that letter and tossed it into the fire. But the truth was, when the men stopped, talking at the end of a long day, and the lamps in the bunkhouse went out, the silence out on the range sank deep into his bones, a kind of loneliness no amount of land or cattle could fill. So when the town gossip, Mrs. Caldwell, mentioned in passing the following week that a new wagon of brides would be coming in and that any man with a steady income and decent morals could place a request, Everett had surprised himself by asking where a man would go to inquire. By noon he held a thick envelope containing profiles, letters and tiny sepia photographs of women from Boston, New York, Chicago, and mining towns out west, women who'd answered newspaper ads and church notices, women who'd decided that being a stranger's wife in the frontier was better than what they were leaving behind. Everett had taken the envelope home, poured himself a drink, and sat at his big oak table beneath the mounted longhorn that loomed over the dining room, like a silent judge. The house creaked around him as he read letter after letter. Some were pretty enough, full of careful handwriting and hopeful phrases, promising to be dutiful and hard-working, obedient but kind, willing to learn the ways of the West. Some mentioned they could cook, so tend to chickens, One boasted of playing the piano. The faces in the small, grainy photographs looked washed out. Eyes smudged shadows, features blurred, but still, he could tell which ones had been pretty once and which ones were trying to smile through bad lighting. And worse luck, only one letter stood out. And it wasn't because of beauty or poetry. It was because of how little it said. No name, just initials LH, no flowery promises. No talk of music or embroidery. Only a short, blunt paragraph in small, neat handwriting. I am 23 years old. I can cook, mend, and work from before sunrise to after sundown without complaint. I have no family and no expectations beyond fair treatment and a roof that does not leak. If you want a decorative wife to entertain your guests, do not choose me. If you want a partner to help keep a household running and stand by you in hard times, I will do my best. There was no attached photograph, only a single line. In the margin written by the agency clerk, in a different hand, plain, has a scar. Previously rejected by other applicants. Everett had stared at that line, longer than he meant to. Previously rejected. The words stirred something in him he didn't particularly want to name. Almost without thinking, he reached for his checkbook. He wrote out the fee in a firm hand, sealed the envelope, and sent it back with the next rider into town. Maybe it was the whiskey. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the stubborn, contrary part of him that hated the idea of picking a wife the same way the other ranchers did, like choosing the prettiest filly. Or maybe it was that he knew something about being judged for what people thought they saw on the surface, without understanding what it had taken to get there. Now, weeks later, as the last gusts of winter rattled the platform, Everett watched the women step off the train one by one. The agent, a fussy little man with a too-short coat, called out names as husbands, new and prospective, stepped forward. There was nervous laughter, a few awkward embraces, a couple of hiccuping sobs quickly smothered. One girl dropped her bag and nearly tripped. Another clung to a Bible like if she let go she'd drown. Everett scanned the crowd, searching for someone who didn't have a man already moving toward her, someone holding back at the edges. There were several. A stout woman with red cheeks, a slim brunette chewing her lip, a freckled girl blinking in the harsh light. But none bore his initials. None looked toward him with the mixture of dread and determination he'd come to expect from this arrangement. Hank stood near the hitching rail, arms folded, watching him with open curiosity. "You sure about this, boss?" he'd asked on the ride in, his voice half teasing, half worried. "A man like you could take his pick of half the gals between here and Helena. Don't need no agency to find you a wife." Everett had only grunted. The kind of women Hank meant were saloon girls, widows with hungry eyes, girls who giggled when they looked at his money instead of into his face, ones who'd be happy enough to share his bed but not his burdens. He needed more than that, or at least that's what he'd told himself. The agent finished his list. And yet there remained at the far end of the platform a solitary figure the others seemed to avoid, a woman in a long, plain black dress, her shape slender but straight-backed, her gloved hands gripping the handle of a scuffed brown suitcase. A black scarf was wound around her head and neck, shadowing her features. Dark hair peeked out in loose coils beneath it. She stood slightly apart, as if she'd drawn an invisible line in the planks around herself and dared anyone to cross it. "In that one?" Everett asked, stepping closer to the agent. "You didn't call her name." The agent followed his gaze and sniffed. "Ah, that would be Miss LH, arrived on a later list. Your bride, Mr. Kane." He said it with an odd mix of relief and distaste, like he was glad to be rid of a troublesome parcel. "You'll need to sign here to confirm receipt." Receipt. As if she were a crate of tools. Everett took the pen but didn't sign yet. He watched her instead. She'd turned slightly away, her profile visible beneath the edge of the scarf. The winter light caught the line of her nose, the curve of her cheekbone. Not bad, he thought automatically. Not the kind of beauty that slapped you in the face, but something quieter, more stubborn. The wind tugged at her skirt, whipping it around her ankles, and she stood firm, boots planted as if she'd learned long ago never to let the ground steal her balance. There was a dignity to the way she held herself, chin high, shoulders squared. That didn't match the notation plain scrawled on her file. He signed, the ink scratching across the paper, and the agent wasted no more time, clapping his hands briskly. "Miss LH, Your husband has arrived." The woman flinched at the word husband, so faintly that most wouldn't have noticed. But Everett did. She turned slowly, eyes lifting to find his figure framed against the dull sky. For a heartbeat, the platform, the wind, the murmurs of curious onlookers, all of it fell away. It was just the two of them, bride and groom. Strangers bound by ink on paper and an arrangement neither fully understood. She began to walk toward him, each step measured, suitcase swinging slightly at her side. He noticed the cut of her coat, mended but clean, the careful stitches along the hem that spoke of long nights with needle and thread. He saw the small tear near one cuff where someone had caught it on a nail and patched it as best they could. He still couldn't see her face clearly. The scarf's shadow clung stubbornly. When she reached him, she stopped just beyond arm's length and dipped her head. "Mr. Kane," she said. Her voice surprised him. It was low and soft, with the faintest trace of an Eastern accent polished by education, not the rough drawl he heard from most women out here. "Thank you for coming." He'd expected desperation or fluttering gratitude. Instead, he heard something like control, as if she'd been practicing how to say those words without sounding too hopeful. "Miss L.H.," he replied, removing his hat out of habit. "You have a name to go with those letters?" One corner of her mouth twitched, as if she were unused to amusement but recognized it when it knocked. Lena Hart." She paused, then lifted a hand to the edge of her scarf. "I suppose I should—" She trailed off, fingers tightening on the fabric as if it were armor. Everett watched, an unexpected flicker of unease sparking in his chest. He'd told himself he didn't care what she looked like. He'd told himself a dozen times while riding in that he was buying help, not beauty, that he'd chosen a woman who knew how to work and understood hardship, not a pretty ornament to show off in town. But as she hesitated, the crowd's whispers seemed to swell. That must be her. Heard something's wrong with her face. Poor thing. No wonder nobody else claimed her. Lena drew in a breath he almost felt rather than heard. Then, with a quick, decisive motion, she unwound the scarf and let it fall around her shoulders. The world snapped into sharp focus. For a second, Everett forgot to breathe. Her face was not plain. Not by any measure he understood. Her features were fine and clear. Cheekbones high, chin firm, lips full but pressed into a nervous line. Her skin, where it was smooth, had a porcelain quality that suggested she hadn't always lived in harsh weather. Thick lashes framed eyes of an arresting gray-green, like a river in winter when the ice is starting to break. But running from just above her left eyebrow, curving down across her temple and the upper crest of her cheek, was a scar, a pale, twisted line, jagged in places, the ghost of a wound that must have once torn her flesh apart. It was not gruesome. It had healed cleanly enough, but it disrupted the symmetry of her beauty, drawing the eye, breaking the illusion that faces,